Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've booked and come along to hear about Churchyards, because that's what I'm talking about. I'm Helen Gamble. I work at the Lincolnshire Wolds Countryside Service. So I just work within the Lincolnshire Wolds area of outstanding natural beauty. But this project can be run anywhere if you've got a churchyard, a graveyard or a cemetery. There is a national project called Caring for God's Acre, which does amazing things as well, and they run national conferences. And a lot of the work that we do, I was inspired about what they were doing when they set up as a small project, and they've got funding to take it much wider, nationwide as well. I brought a load of leaflets about the Lincolnshire Wolds, and also we've got a fact sheet there that we've done in conjunction with the Greater Lincolnshire Nature Partnership and the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. So anything that you hear today is transferable to any churchyard, graveyard or cemetery. And I'm just going to say now, there is no one size fits all. Each churchyard, each graveyard and each cemetery is different. The communities that manage them are different. And, you know, the communities and the churchyards, graveyards, cemeteries, they each need something slightly different. So, as I said, there is no one size fits all. Tonight, it's all about giving you ideas, what works for some communities in the Wolds. I'll talk about what didn't work as well, and I think that's the key thing. But there's lots of information out there. So for the Lincolnshire concept of it as well. So we're going to take it back to basics. What is God's Acre? Well, it is the churchyard, graveyard or cemetery, and it was termed God's Acre a while ago as well, a few years ago. But it is an extension of the church and the area of worship, so there are the sensitivities connected to that. It is a sanctuary for the living as well as the departed, probably more so now after the past near 2 years that we've been living through. But often it is the only open space in a village or even a town for the wider community to gather in and use. I work in the Lincolnshire Wolds, which is around about 90 settlements, around about 70 parish councils, but each of those settlements will have a church, and often people move to the countryside for the big open space where they can walk where they like. Well, you can't, unfortunately, or even if you could walk somewhere out in the open countryside, you might be 5 foot walking through oilseed rape that's 6 foot. So actually the spaces in the villages are very few and far between, apart from churchyards. And it also is, for a small space, and certainly some of the town cemeteries are probably a lot larger, there can be a surprising diverse range of habitats. And also in villages, churches, the diocese would have kept records for everything that went on in the village church. So that's often, if you're interested in history, historical aspects, the church is a good starting point to find out about your village. So, to the church, off we go. This has been redone. This is at Merrim-on-the-Hill, just outside Horncastle. And now it's got a little barn owl, an owl carved on the top as well. So as we go through, I'll talk about the churches that I've taken photos of over the past 15 years as we've been running this project on and off. And it's not really a project anymore, it's just part of my day-to-day work, along with the agriculture, the geodiversity, the biodiversity, the community work that we do in the Wolds. So the key aspects, which I'm going to break this down to, is the grassland and flowers in your churchyard, the trees and shrubs, the insects, bats. We can't talk about churchyards and churches without bats, and the other mammals, reptiles, lichens, stonework, geology, metalwork, archaeology, history, traditions, and the community aspect. So it's a little bit of everything tonight. Take from it what you will. There's lots of other information out there. churchyards are often the most undisturbed place in the parish, certainly in Lincolnshire, where we have a strong element of arable cropped land. So the grassland will be generally undisturbed, so it won't have been ploughed, it won't have been sprayed or anything. It'll have been grazed. We still have a few churchyards in the Wolds that have sheep grazing on them every so often. Hay cuts are often taken from churchyards, and that is actually a really good way of managing grassland if you want a summer flowering meadow. But with most areas, if you think of it as your garden, you'll have some areas of your garden that are quite heavily managed and some areas towards the back, the hedges, that are a little bit more overgrown. The most extensively used parts of the churchyard, the routes to the door from the road or the car park, those areas that have the most recent burials in or memorial gardens will often be cut shorter, more regularly. And then there'll be some areas that are hardly visited, and if you're interested in creating a meadow, those are the areas to go for. Choose the management for the grass and the resources you have. We have one churchyard in the Wolds, funny enough, Mereham on the Hill, just outside of Horncastle. One side of the church is cut religiously, excuse the pun, every week. Because that's the most, because there was two camps of thought in the village. One wanted it very short, the other one wanted a meadow. So one side of the church is a short grass, the other side is left up to grow as a meadow. It's got oxeye daisies in it. A couple of years ago I got a call from the church warden. I've finally done it. I finally got orchids. After 7 years of managing it as a meadow, she finally got orchids coming back up in it. And they were very lucky in that parish. The people that were interested in it, they had the kit that they could strim it, they could remove it as a hay crop and get rid of the hay. But it was a stunning area. But so was the other side. And that's the thing. It's a case of the management for the grass, the management the resources that you have for it, and also the sensitivities of it being, as I said, an extension of the church, if you will. This is a spring flowering meadow. Now, if you ever come over to Louth, these are all Wolds churches. I can't help that, I'm afraid. But this is these are the orchids, pyramidal orchids that were in the Mereham on the Hill churchyard. And then this churchyard is Utterby, just north of Louth, on the A16, and they manage it as a spring meadow. So they don't cut it until all the primroses, the cowslips and everything have flowered, and it is a riot of colour, an absolute beautiful colour. April, May time is beautiful, and then they cut and remove it and keep it fairly long. But it's a stunning churchyard during the spring, and it is stunning. And I say, the Mereham on the Hill one, they've got orchids there now. Most of it is knee-high, thigh-high oxeye daisies before they cut and remove it. So that's a good example of different churchyards and grassland management. And as I said, there is no one-size-fits-all on this. Trees and shrubs. Well, the churchyard will often contain the oldest trees in the parish. Yew, either common or Irish. The Irish one is the one that grows like that, like a upturned wine glass, if you like. And then the common or the English yew is a little bit more widespread. And a lot of people want to plant trees in memory of people, but the important thing is not to overcrowd a churchyard with trees, because you get the sap, you get the aphids, everything going onto the headstones. And also, you've got to remember, trees need management. They might not need management for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, but they will need management. So They may need to be trimmed, maintained or cut down, and that's one thing to remember when they're planted in memory of loved ones. Churchyards, trees in churchyards are generally exempt from felling licences because it's church land, and there is a whole different array of rules and regulations that relate to church land. The Diocese Advisory Committee can give permission for removal of trees, digging into the ground to put in notice boards or benches or whatever. So it's something to be thinking on. Yew trees, they do have the poisonous berry, which is something to be thinking on for if you're looking at grazing it. But also yews historically were planted because the timber, the branches from yew, were used as longbows, for the timber for longbows. And skipping forward a little bit while I'm chatting about it, they used to hold archery practices in churchyards, and in some cases in parts of the country you can actually find where they used to sharpen the arrow points against the church or the headstones when they were doing the archery practice, because most of the landowners had to have a standing army. But the thing is with trees, if they are cut down, if they're self-set, this was an ash tree that was self-set, and somebody had, a few years ago, this is actually the churchyard that first got me interested in churchyards. They had a lot of trees that needed management because the roots were starting to lift the headstones, and the headstones are markers for burials. So there is an issue there with tree roots. If the tree comes down, if it lifts, if it comes down and the roots come up with it, all manner of things could be exposed. So this ash tree had been self-set and grown and left, and then somebody probably about 20 years ago cut it down at the stump and it re-sprouted, because that's what all native deciduous trees do. If you cut it at the stump, it'll come up multi-stemmed. So we had some serious issues with starting to tilt the headstones and things. So we cut them, got some because that was far too big then for volunteers to do. So it was a case of we managed to help them with some funding to cut the trees down, treat the stumps, chip the wood, to protect the integrity of the headstones and the burials. But it also opened it up. Obviously, it looks very bare because the tree, the leaves had actually, dampened down a lot of the vegetation growth. But it is amazing now. So that's the type of thing. If you've got trees, if you're going to try and keep on top of them and keep them small or get rid of them, you do need to take some form of action to stop them from regrowing too much. And insects, like any good garden, they can be an important haven for butterflies, moths, bees, wasps, and importantly, ivy growing on the church or in the trees. Obviously, there's the importance of the nectar source and very late nectar source on ivy, and because it's an evergreen plant, it's great refuge for bees, insects, but you've also got to be aware that if it's grown on the church, have any of you ever dealt with ivy growing on a building?
Yes.
Yes. You don't cut it and pull it straight away. That's a big no-no. If you're going to try and deal with ivy, you need to cut section out of it where you want it, and then leave it for as long as possible, because all the roots get into the brickwork and the mortar, and if you start pulling it before the roots have died, you could pull stonework out and mortar out on yourself, regardless of the damage you may do to the building. You may hurt yourself by pulling ivy out. And generally in trees, They're okay in trees unless the tree is entirely covered, and is the weight of it becomes too much as well. So, but generally, if you've got piles of dead wood, like habitat piles, or piles of stone from broken masonry or roof slates or whatever else, those are great for overwintering insects, reptiles, anything like that. So again, a good variety of habitats. It'd be great if you could get a compost area going, although always keep your compost area away from high areas of traffic. Most people would automatically put a compost bin or area out of the way of most people. Not only because compost can smell in high summer, but also you get grass snakes nesting on them or basking in compost heaps. And there's nothing worse than a scream from somebody who's popped something and walking past and there's a nest of grass snakes there. It is lovely to see, but not everybody likes snakes. So, and of course, in churchyards, we do events with children. I'll talk about our rucksack or our packs later. But, you know, there is nothing nicer than seeing a dozen kids running around the churchyard with bug pots, looking for bugs, you know, catching snails. I mean, Nathaniel here, very, very pleased with his collection of snails he had going on. But it just makes it alive. And this churchyard is at Belchford, and they used sheep graze it. So we had some sheep in the longer areas, unvisited areas of the graveyard, and it was just lovely. They used to have an amazing display of bluebells. It was absolutely stunning bluebells and crocuses as well. Now, bats often are connected to churchyards, obviously roosting in the trees, eaves, tombs, and under the roof tiles. A lot of church groups are still unaware that the Lincolnshire Bat Group will come out and do a free survey for you on your bats. It's available to all churches in the diocese. Bats aren't normally an issue for church councils, but there are exceptions. It's a historic building. Bats love that type of thing because they're quite quiet, undisturbed, constant temperature, i.e. quite cold, which is great for a winter roost. But if you're ever managing a church and you need work done, the architect, because the diocese have strict rules, any work that needs doing has to be okayed and signed off by an architect. It's an historic building, most of them are grade 2. But you need to make sure that there's a bat survey done and the bat group are in, because there has been instances, even in Lincolnshire, where work was done, the bat group and the architect hadn't really signed off on it, and at one stage they were looking at prosecuting the church warden because work had been done, and it was just a missed opportunity rather than willfully done. It was just, so bats aren't mainly an issue. If you want to know about bats in churches, Tattershall is great for that. Ian Nixon looks after that from the Bat Group. And quite often it's when they say, there's bat muck on things. Well, bats mainly eat moths, and there's things that they hardly digest. Just such fine, papery, dry, tiny like mouse poo. They're generally not too bad, but it's a case of give and take and just being aware of them. Now, we did a number of surveys, seminars back 15 years ago when we did this, and this is Ian Nixon here with a tiny bat, and they are that small, and these were ones from the spring that had come out of roost because it was too early.
I thought it was a snail.
No, it's actually a bat, and it's the size of the top of my thumb, if that. So not even an inch, and that's a pipistrelle. And he let me, because you need a license before you can handle bats and everything, and or survey for them and things like that. But I did hold it, and it is like being attacked by a wet, soggy toothbrush, because it was trying to bite me, and it was like, I'm sure if I was a moth or a butterfly, it would hurt, but it was just so funny. It was really trying to gnaw at my finger, and it was just like being attacked by a wet, soggy toothbrush. But that's the size they are. People freak out. But the most bats that you would get, pipistrelles is the most common, and they're about that size. But the Dorbenton ones tend to hunt over water at dusk. The pipistrelles come out one of the first. You can get bigger bats, but in churches, it's mainly going to be pipistrelles, especially at dusk. If you're walking across near the lake, because that's when you can really see them. Because quite often you either need a clear sky so you can see them flitting, and flitting is the best word for them really, or skimming over the water, so fast. But in churchyards, as I said, because you've potentially got big old trees, big old churchyard with roosting capabilities and opportunities. If you've got a mix of habitats in the churchyard, in the hedges and fields adjacent to it, it should provide enough insects for quite a good hunting ground, really. Reptiles, as I've always mentioned, grass snakes and compost heaps. Favourite basking area are compost heaps. But we've had slow worms, newts, frogs. A lot of people think newts and frogs and toads live all the time in the water. They don't. They spend most of the time in grassland, near water, and it all depends what habitats you've got in the surrounding countryside. But the biggest excitement on any event that we do is when somebody pokes around in the damp corner with a few stones kicking around, and the important thing with anything that you ever find, and with the education pack as well, is to make sure whatever is collected is actually put back where they collected it from. But yeah, the excitement of, in fact, we had the entire school out at Scamblesby when we launched the rucksacks back 15 years ago, or the education packs. The entire school came out, and most excitement was finding that. Now lichens. Now these are the small crusty things you find on headstones, as I often to refer to, but they are so special, are lichens. And in Lincolnshire at Alsbee Churchyard, there's some very rare lichens. In Lincolnshire, as I said, because we're not, I'm coming on to the geology in a little bit, we don't have a lot of exposed stone. You've probably got more exposed stone in Lincoln itself, with the big old buildings, than we have in these smaller villages. But you do need, for the specialist churchyard lichens, you do need the stone for them to attach onto. You can get lichens in trees and the rest of it, but actually the stone ones are actually very interesting, and there is a cracking couple of field study guides with lichens in churchyards as a field guide. It's actually quite interesting. But there was a period about 20-30 years ago where a lot of churchyards would actually have all their headstones moved to the edge of the churchyard and also cleaned chemically, which actually stripped off all the lichens and everything else. If, on a heritage point of view, if you're surveying your headstones to make a note of the names, the dates, the inscriptions on them, which is very interesting, these days a decent digital camera and a bottle of water. Squirt the headstones with a bottle of water, a spray of water, take a photo, put it on your camera, on your phone, or pop them onto a laptop, and you can really alter the contrast, which actually makes the inscriptions really stand out, so they're much easier to record if you want to do it yourself. The Lincolnshire Family History Society have already done the bulk of the headstones in Lincolnshire, but there is no real need to clean lichens or moss off headstones. This is one of my favourites. These are like what we call bird's nest lichens, and this is a block of stone and then the mortar on it. So this block of stone is about that. So these are actually quite small, but quite often they have little spores on the inside, little packets of not seeds, but spores that will go out. And once it rains, the raindrops and the weight of the rain and the wind that's associated with the rain will actually knock out the spores from these little cups. And that's how they spread themselves. Very slow growing. This patch of lichen, maybe 200 years old. But from headstones, because you've got the inscription and the dates of the headstones, you can actually measure the lichens and know how old the lichens are from the head of the date of the headstones. It's really, really exciting. And even though there may be just the crusty bits on the headstones, we had people, we did a seminar, and all these people are looking at this cross with the lichens, and they're queuing up and literally barging each other out of the way. To look, because there's a chap called Professor Mark Seawood, if you've ever heard him speak. He's certainly the UK expert, if not the world expert, on lichens. And he's a joy to listen to. And as I said, we've had to put on special days when he's been speaking, because he's so enthusiastic and gets people interested in the crusty bits on headstones. But as I said, geology. Now, I quite like geology. I'm a bit of a rock chick. I got a degree in geodiversity a few years ago. But Lincolnshire is not renowned as a rocky county. But we have geology. Everywhere's got geology. And quite often, the best place to experience it is a churchyard, or, for example, the cathedral, or places like that, because local churches will be built of the local stone. Or the posher churches, the bigger churches, the cathedrals, will have had stone imported into it. You can see local stone in examples of bedding planes, fossils and minerals. The exotic stones that can be found, such as slate headstones, we're obviously nowhere near any slate, so to see a series of slate headstones, it actually charts the expansion of road, canals and railway links into the county from elsewhere. So from a historic point of view, that's actually itself quite interesting. We did some, I was at Helen Churchyard, and they were doing looking for lost headstones, and we do a trick called grovelling, which sounds exciting. It is actually, but you get a long metal spike, like a pigtail fencing spike, and you dig it in the ground and wiggle it. And lift it up, dig it in the ground and wiggle it until you hit something hard about 4 inches deep, and then you brobble round it, and you can actually discover laid down headstones. And we came across a series at Hemingway where there was about a dozen pristine slate headstones that had been laid down and grassed over. And you could even see, because headstones, they're like the reverse of an iceberg. You end up with about 2/3 out and 1/3 in, whereas icebergs are 2/3 down and 1/3 up. And you can also find the mason's marks about which mason in the local town or the village, because actually inscribe the headstones. So that itself is really interesting, as well as the rocks and the geology, which, as I said, is something I love. Now these are bedding planes. Does anybody know much about geology? So I can say what I like now, I'm only joking. Geology, this is a headstone, and it's obviously upright, but imagine that tilted on the ground. each of these tiny bedding planes is where a layer of sand or silt had been laid down. Probably this is quite a rough sandstone, so it would have been in a delta environment. So if you think, probably all seen the photos where the Amazon comes out and it's brown mud, and then it hits a current and it all turns blue again. Well, it's the drop-in, as the energy comes out of the water, as it meets the wider ocean, the energy disperses, and the energy that has been carrying the silt, the soil, the bits of sand, makes all that's in suspension drop out, and that's how you get these different bedding planes. So these are all slightly different periods of time that over millennia has compacted and changed to a sedimentary rock. So you get all these, and on coastal areas you can actually get the tides. The spring and the spring tides actually are slightly different. It's a bit like counting the rings of a tree, the growth rings of a tree. You can actually count in some very fine siltstones the spring tides and neap tides in the stone. But of course, this is starting to spoil. If anybody's got some old bricks, they'll maybe seen this on brickwork, where the edge of the stone comes away. And I mentioned about grazing in Churchyard. This damage here is where some sheep were in the churchyard and they basically nagged out the grass. And no one's going to put docile sheep in a churchyard. They're going to put the slightly rougher ones. So these sheep had been up on the headstones trying to gnaw at the lichens, and they'd actually knocked quite a bit of the stonework off as well. And also, strimming can do this type of thing around the bottom of headstones. So if you've got the base of a headstone and there's a lot of long grass there and people want to clear it out, people will often use a strimmer, and even a nylon head on a strimmer where you've got the nylon cord, doesn't even have to be the metal blade, but that can eventually weaken the edge of the stone where it's continually every month trimmed or whatever over years, and it can actually weaken it and create this spalling at the bottom of the headstones, which isn't great for the stone, certainly isn't great for the strimmer cord, but also, if you think about it, this type of layer, this top layer, is where the inscription is as well. As well as the damage to the lichens, you'll see all this lichens coming off. So we do say, please don't string around the bottom of your headstones. But the geology in the county, even though it's not in-your-face Peak District type of geology, it's a reflection of the local geology anyway. So this is at Loughborough Church, just north of Louth. Stunning chalk. Now, chalk isn't really a great building stone, is it? Because it's too soft. It's our youngest rock in the country. It's really too soft. So all the strength-bearing stone around the windows, the cornices, everything is actually of a different stone which would have been brought in, but the local stone there is chalk. And then, of course, where we don't have any hard rock to build churches of, we have clay, and a lot of villages around this. This is at Alsbee, where they don't have any hard rock to quarry. They dug brick pits and fired their own bricks, and this is at Alsbee Church, which is lovely brick, Victorian brick. So it's a reflection of the underlying geology. And looking at the stonework, I know I've mentioned some of this already, but looking at the headstones, you can learn about the social history of the area. Quite often, in Lincolnshire, just like most counties, large landed families would have had a special pattern cut to order and have numerous blanks carved and stored. And if you're looking at headstones, if you're interested in the history or the genealogy, and there's a lot of people out there who will travel halfway across the globe to find the headstones of distant relatives. Not at the moment, obviously, but masons' marks at the bottom of headstones. Most mark, I think Horncastle at one stage had about 8 stone masons. And the inside of the church, the stonework weren't weathered as much either. So this is going back to where I mentioned about a special pattern cut to order. This is one particular one. This is at Burwell Church where we had the tree issue. One of the first ones I got involved with. The local large landed family had this blanks, a whole set of them done, and they tend to have them put up once. All at once, they decide, and that's going to be, it's a bit like the family crest. We're going to have a headstone, that's the pattern. So they cut all the blanks. So they cut all the engraving, but not the wording, obviously. And interestingly, you can see this one's, as we call it, spalled. Now, once you cut stone from a quarry, and it's engraved, it can be quite damp when it's cut. Can the stone, it sounds daft saying stone is damp, but it's then it hardens off, and it's what geologists call quarry juice. So they cut it, they carve it, and it sets. So some of these headstones would have been stored for 100 years, 50 years, whatever. And the one that was the most pristine was the one that was carved at the time of the original carving, where the inscription and the name and the dates was. That was pristine. Because the others, when you go in and then carve the inscription and the dates after it's already hardened, it's the same as taking a metal blade to the bottom of a headstone. So they're actually breaking that quarry juice to allow weathering to take part, and that's where you get the spalling. So it was quite strange seeing this whole row of headstones, and the most pristine one was the oldest one. But again, social history of large landed families, and a lot of churches in the Wolds, certainly, and I'm talking about the Wolds because that's where I've got the most experience, but it happens elsewhere. If you've got a large landed family it's what they call a closed parish. So a closed parish would be where one landowner owns the entire parish, and therefore the church is almost like a mini version of the large house or the estate house, or they've had maybe James Fowler come in, and it's like a mini St James's but further out, and everybody was expected to go to the church because everybody in the parish were tenanted farmers for the large landowners, so they'd often go to the same church and have to go. Whereas then you had open parishes where you had different landowners, and the more open parishes, as they were called, with different landowners and people who worked maybe in the towns and went back to the village, that is where examples of Methodism flourished, where there was space for different levels of Christianity, different aspects of Christianity. And you can still find occasionally just Quaker burial grounds as well, where you've maybe got half a dozen Quaker markers, but no land really attached to it because there was never a building for them. And the stonework inside. Who's been to the Ramblers Church at Walesby? Who's had a walk up the hill at Ramblers Church? It's on the Viking Way. This is inside, little ring of faces roughly carved onto the inside pillars of the I think that is ironstone. It could be the ironstone, it could be the Claxby, Tilby limestone. Can't quite decide. It's not really weathered enough for the ironstone, but because it's inside, it gives it a slightly different tinge. Now, metalwork is, again, apart from Scunthorpe and a few other places, we don't have a huge amount of metalwork, but The railings on the boundary around the individual graves, they often, metalwork is a feature, and it's often iron. Now there's a couple of different, there's two different types of iron. The cast iron is resistant to corrosion, but it's very, very brittle. So, and then the lead is very soft and can slump, and it's often used actually on headstones, which is quite strange, but it detaches itself. Again, it's something that's difficult to repair but needs specialist attention. But the interesting thing about the metalwork, boundaries, gates, whatever, is they attract their own different types of lichen as well. So more crusty things to look at. And this was a very old head marker. It's probably from one of the wars. And again, you've actually got the old estate fencing on the edge of the churchyard there. That's at Claxby, near Walesby. And again, Burwell again. So we've got actually the lead letters put onto it, and you can see where the rains come down, the lichens, and then as it's come down, the letters have actually have bled and almost done lead poisoning, so there's no much lichen growth beneath them. So archaeology is many of the churches that we actually see today are built on pre-Christian sites. Mainly because when they were building the churches, they actually chose the sites of pre-Christian worship, because the general populace, the workers, people who worked the land, that was what they knew. So it's not quite build a site and they will come to it. It's like, we'll use a site because people are used to coming to it. And as a result of that, some churchyards contain evidence of earlier human use, some of which may be visible to the eye, some of which may be just the pure location of the church. And circular sites are often thought as pre-Christian, as are sites next to water. Anything that you do in a churchyard, so for example, we've had a few churches in the Wolds wanting to have piped water to the church, so they can create a small kitchen area in the church where there may be no village hall in the area to use. Anything digging a trench through a churchyard, you have to have a watching brief by archaeologists. So if you're putting mains water into a building, even if you're putting electricity into a church, some churches still don't have electricity, things like that, you have to have a watching brief, which actually bumps the price up. But if you do something for the church, the diocese would be involved and should be able to give you all that information. This is at Alsbee Church, north of Louth again, the one with the beautiful spring meadow. You go into the porch, and as you go into the main body of the church, there's the very old archway. And has anybody heard of the Green Man? A symbol of the cycle of life, the growing seasons. This is an example of a Green Man. And there was a lot of green men done during the Victorian era and the Gothic era, but this is one of the original ones. And this is what they call a wood woes, which is a little bit similar to a Green Man symbol. And it looks like there's a monkey sat on his feet. So again, very much paying homage to the pre-Christian beliefs. Which actually, it wasn't one or the other. There was still people who worked the land, was very much people that, were so intrinsically linked to the land that the Green Man made sense to them, the cycle of the seasons, the growing year, everything. That is why they built sites where they did. And this is Burwell, one of the first churches I've mentioned about already. Again, that's sat halfway up the hill. It's not actually in the village itself, it's sat halfway up the hill, but that would have been possibly because it's also called St Michael's, which certain names some people think are related to pre-Christian sites as well. The history, we've spoken about so much, but if you're into history, a church and a churchyard depict the historical record far better than anything else in a parish. The rise and fall of families, the bonds through marriages. I'm going to marry my eldest son to their eldest daughter in the next parish to meld the families. We've all seen Jane Eyre and read the Austen novels, but sweep of illnesses through an area, sometimes when you're actually looking at some of the headstone inscriptions, breaks your heart, because you'll see where a childhood epidemic ripped through the area, and you'll see, a little row of tiny headstones, quite often with families, brothers and sisters, all together, which is quite heartbreaking. And with anything to do with the church, any history like that, there is special archives at Lincoln Cathedral for all the churches in the diocese. This is an example of, these are called hatchments, where the family crest is dotted on hatchments around the church, where you have a closed village. So this is at, I can't remember whether this is at Well Church or whether it is at Langton by Spilsby, I'm not sure on that. And this is a Lynch Gate. They have a huge amount of proper Lynch Gates. This isn't an original one, but quite often they would, in older parts of the older Lynch Gates, they would be big enough to actually store the coffin in the day before any service, and where the pallbearers could stand out of the rain before they entered the church. So, and this is the Ramblers Church, All Saints at Claxby. Sorry. It's not used as a church at the moment as for regular service. The church itself is sat up. In fact, actually, it was on the poster. That's the Ramblers Church on the Viking Way at Walesby, and that's the one. That church was built for the medieval village that used to be at the top of the hill at Walesby, and on aerial photos, there's actually an interpretation panel now in the churchyard. On aerial photos, you can see where the old houses would have stood and the old cattle sheds and things like that on the old medieval farming system. But the plague, the rise of sheep walks, where a lot of the wolds went back to grass and had sheep running over it because it was such good business, and a lot of the peasants were chucked off the land. A lot of these villages in the wolds and great, wider Lincolnshire became deserted. So this church became defunct, but the village resettled at the bottom of the hill. And now there's a St Mary's Church there, which is an arts and crafts style, which is actually lovely. But this stained glass window was popped in because so many people used to walk there. And it says, and it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day. So it's actually quite a nice depiction of a church now, which is lovely to visit, very nice and quiet. You get stunning views from the Wolds westwards across. You can see the cathedral on the Lincoln Edge and everything. So it is a lovely church. If you ever get a chance, it is nice. And traditions. Churchyards were, and as I said, sometimes the only gathering space for the community, and a much wider series of events than today. You could have beer festivals, you bet on a cockfight. They were all organised by church wardens to raise funds for themselves and the church. fairs were held, archery practice was carried out. As I've already mentioned, the wood from the yew was very good for the English longbow. And the stone buildings, as I said, used to sharpen the points on them because they used to have to undertake archery practice. But I think churchyards are there for everyone to enjoy, to use, to help manage, all in conjunction with the church, the parochial church council. And actually, because there's been such a drop-off in numbers of people attending services over decades, a lot of people feel a bit nervous about going into churchyards, and certainly churches. But actually, on one of the churches that we've been working with, we funded some benches to go in the churchyard, and the locals couldn't believe how many people sat and used the benches. Like the church wardens were like, but there's people in the churchyard. Because it's nice, it's quiet, you can escape the hustle and bustle. It's actually a green space where you can actually shut the gate. If you've got small children, a pushchair, you can normally get a pushchair into a churchyard. Where else in a lot of these little villages can you actually let your kids run around with and know that there's no traffic going to bull past or whatever? So maybe it's a time we actually started some new traditions. This is Tafwell Art Festival, which is held Whitsun Bank Holiday in May, the end of May, and they used to have spinning demonstrations in. We used to put the marquee up in the churchyard, and yeah, people used to get a cup of tea, a sliced Victoria cake, and sit on a headstone and eat that, and have a go at learning how to spin and things like that. And the church, the God's Acre packs that we do, this is Manby Beaver Colony, that's what they're called, isn't it? Beavers. Doing all the activity pack in the churchyard. With the intense smell of wild garlic there. That's ramsons, as I would call it, wild garlic. But it's a picture, and they loved it, absolutely loved it. But I think we need to get people using churchyards again, otherwise they're just going to disappear. Now the God's Acre rucksacks, I'll just scoot over here and pick up his one I brought earlier. This was to encourage families and schools and groups to explore the local churchyards and get awareness of different aspects of them. We did these initially for about 30 churches in the Wolds. A lot of churches put their own information in as well. We ran activity days during, for example, the Lincolnshire Wolds Walking Festival and other events, and done them special events for beaver groups and things like that. And basically what it is a simple pack with lots of information, how to identify your trees, how to identify butterflies, lichens, we like lichens, I keep coming back to lichens, how to measure a tree so you can tell how tall it is and how old it is, going back to the tree keys, evergreens, also little things like the different window styles in a church and what it actually means. So we've got one here, so the Tudor period, a square one at the very bottom, Tudor. Now I'm not being funny, I'm no good on history, right? So when was the Tudor period? It was when Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot was. Because you ask any 8-year-old, they probably wouldn't know, but Guy Fawkes, they know. You ask a 51-year-old when the Tudor period, I have no idea, but I know when Guy Fawkes, it puts it into context, so you can actually date the different parts of the church, because the church has never been one building and it's never been altered. So, so we've got Saxon, Romanesque, which, Norman Conquest, 1066, I know that. Transition to early English. The Crusades, signing of the Magna Carta, and then we've got butterflies in churchyards, which actually I brought from my previous job. That was my leaflet from my previous job. And then we've got these type of things, which are the field study guides. So we've got bugs on bushes, that's your insect guide. And there we go. Common churchyard lichens. I mean, how special is that? But again, it gives you simple photos, and actually, if you're into your rocks, like obviously I am, it'll tell you whether it's on acidic or alkaline rocks. So that's all that. And we also provide in here things like bug pots, a little tray of bug pots, and calculators, solar power calculators, tape measures, crayons. But we've run those as events. Here we've got 3 generations here. Grandad, Dad, looking for, pulling apart the habitat site, looking for bugs. We've got, how to measure headstones, just playing around. Again, 3 generations here. Can I just do a straw? Who's done bark rubbings before? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. It's surprising. Anybody done brass rubbings before? Yeah. It's the same principle. So basically you get a bit of paper, big chunky wax crayon and go over it. It's great fun. If I do an event and there's gangs of kids turn up, you just take a big box of blank paper and a pack of crayons and they go off and do bark rubbings, tarmac rubbings, all sorts of rubbings, and they're just happy for about an hour, which is amazing. But the community is the heart and soul of the churchyard. It should be managed for each, as I said, there's no one size fits all. If you ever want to get people interested in what's happening in your churchyard, if you manage churchyards or whatever, start a chainsaw at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning in a churchyard, because that will bring them all out, absolutely, and suddenly everyone's interested, which is great because you need to know what's going on in your local area. Notice boards, again, this is at the Ramblers Church. They've done work up there. They've put on there all the stuff that they do in the churchyard, and one of the churches, Haffen outside of Louth, they have a rotating spring flowers, summer flowers, little ID charts that people can look for in their churchyards. So if anything sparked any interest, or it can be about anything, ask the wider community if they want to be involved. Some communities will want to, some won't. For some it might be the practical work, getting the hands dirty, creating a wildflower meadow, doing habitat piles. Some it may be the research of the area. But the important thing is that it all melds together. You can map the locations of key features on your churchyard via a simple survey. And by a simple survey I mean a bit of A4, square block in the middle for the church, gate, and then compost area marked, where snowdrops might come through, or spring flowers, or whatever. See what you've got, and see what you'd like to have, and figure out the best way to get from what you've got to what you'd like to have with the resources you've got. And that's not just how much money can the parish give you towards fueling a mower or a strimmer. It can be how much time can people give. And it's interesting that I've found that the people who do a lot of the stuff in churchyards are the ones that have the biggest gardens in the village. But, during the summer that can all fall down a bit, where they're doing their own gardens, or, they're looking after the grandkids during the school holidays, all that type of thing. So it is a case of figuring out what's best for you and the churchyard, and keeping everyone informed. As I said, chainsaw 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning will get everybody out and upset. Sometimes that's what's needed, sometimes not. And just put a notice up anywhere. The meadow that I mentioned that had the oxeye daisies, and they used to cut it. They used to go in and cut it with some strimmers or mowers at the beginning of the week, on a good week, turn it once, let it dry off, and then they'd have a raking party on a Sunday, and after they'd raked all the grass off, get the barbecue going, open a couple of bottles of wine, get people involved, and it's a community thing then. A bench is an excellent way to just sit and enjoy it all. I brought fact sheets as well as that activity pack, and there's on that fact sheet that's at the back, there's website links to Caring for God's Acre. If you're here, the Wildlife Trust or Lincolnshire County Council, because you're out of my patch, they can provide advice. For funding, the Lincolnshire County Council do a community wildlife grant. They should be able to help your local council. Some of you may be Lincoln City Council, some of you may be North Kay, West Lindsey even, I don't know. And your councillors quite often have a bit of money that can be held for community projects. And if you want to contact me, feel free. My email will be on one of the leaflets or whatever, or just send it to our general one, AONB@Lincolnshire and just put God's Acre, and my admin will pass it to me. Everyone's still sat at the kitchen tables except me. But yeah, again, more people looking for the crusty bits on headstones, and this person isn't praying; they're actually looking not at a small flower in the grass, and everybody else is still watching. But yeah, I hope I've given you some ideas of maybe what to do, or something to think about tonight, tomorrow, or whatever. I'm happy to answer any questions.